The winter of 1882 had been merciless to the Montana Territory, the kind of cold that reached through walls and into bones, that turned breath to ice crystals and made the earth ring like iron under boot heels. Samuel Crawford stood at his kitchen window, watching the snow fall in thick, silent curtains across his ranch, and tried not to think about how empty the house felt behind him. 3 bedrooms that echoed with memories, a dining table set for one, and walls that had once known the sound of children's laughter but now held only the whisper of wind through loose boards. His wife Margaret had been gone 2 years now, taken by the same fever that claimed their infant son, and their daughter Emma had married a banker in Denver, leaving Samuel alone with 800 acres of prairie and a silence so complete it sometimes felt like drowning. He had thought about selling, about following Emma east to civilization and comfort, but something in this harsh land had taken root in his soul, and he could not imagine himself anywhere else. It was on the 7th day of the blizzard that he first saw them through the swirling snow, dark shapes moving like ghosts against the white landscape. Samuel rubbed frost from the window glass and peered out, his breath catching when he realized what he was seeing. People, a small group of them, struggling through the deep drifts toward his ranch house. As they drew closer, he could make out their clothing, the distinctive patterns and colors that marked them as Blackfoot, and his hand instinctively moved to the rifle that hung above the mantel. The frontier had taught him to be wary of unexpected visitors, especially during the harsh winter months when desperation could turn even peaceful people dangerous. But as the group drew closer, Samuel realized these were not raiders or warriors. They moved with the stumbling gait of exhaustion, their forms hunched against the cold, and when they finally reached his porch, he could see that they were a family. An elderly man leaning heavily on a walking stick, a woman perhaps 40 years old, carrying a bundle that might have been a child, and 2 young people who could barely stand upright. Samuel stood at his door for a long moment, rifle in hand, watching them huddled together on his porch. The wind howled around the corners of the house, driving snow through every crack and crevice, and he could hear the soft sound of voices speaking in their native tongue, urgent and frightened. Through the frosted glass, he could see the woman's face, gaunt with hunger and hollow, with the particular desperation that comes from watching loved ones suffer. The old man raised his hand and knocked, the sound barely audible above the storm. Once, twice, 3 times, each knock weaker than the last. Samuel could hear them talking quietly among themselves, could sense their fear and their hope warring in the cold air. He knew what bringing them inside might mean, knew the risks he would be taking in a territory where tensions between settlers and natives ran as deep as mountain rivers. But he also knew what leaving them outside would mean, and that was a weight his conscience could not bear. Samuel opened the door, the blast of cold air hitting him like a physical blow. The family looked up at him with eyes that held no hostility, only exhaustion and a desperate hope that made his chest tight. The woman stepped forward slightly, her arms tightening around the bundle she carried, and spoke in halting English. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My children, they are cold. We have walked many days." Samuel could see that she was telling the truth. Their clothing was inadequate for the brutal weather, and frost had formed on their eyebrows and in their hair. The 2 young people swayed on their feet, and when a gust of wind caught the woman's bundle, Samuel glimpsed the pale face of a child, perhaps 3 years old, whose lips had taken on the blue tinge that spoke of hypothermia. "Come in," Samuel said, stepping back from the door. "All of you, come in." They entered slowly, carefully, as if afraid the invitation might be withdrawn. The warmth of the house seemed to stagger them, and the woman sank immediately into the nearest chair, clutching the child to her chest. Samuel could see now that it was a little girl, unconscious and frighteningly still. The old man remained standing, his weathered face proud despite their desperate circumstances, while the 2 young people moved to stand behind him, a boy of perhaps 16 and a girl slightly younger. "Sit," Samuel said, gesturing to the chairs around his fireplace. "Please sit down." The old man studied him for a moment, then spoke in Blackfoot to the others. The woman looked up at Samuel, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "He says you are kind," she translated. "He says the spirits guided us to your door." Samuel nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond to such trust. He built up the fire until it roared in the hearth, then went to his kitchen to see what food he could offer. His supplies were limited, winter provisions meant for one person, but he had dried meat, canned vegetables, and flour enough to make bread. As he worked, he could hear them talking quietly in their own language, their voices carrying the particular cadence of people making difficult decisions. When he returned to the main room, carrying a pot of stew and a loaf of fresh bread, he found them arranged around the fire like a painting of exhausted travelers. The little girl was awake now, her eyes wide and dark as she watched him approach. The boy had removed his wet moccasins and was flexing his toes, trying to work, feeling back into them. The older girl sat close to the woman, who Samuel realized must be their mother, while the old man remained upright in his chair, dignity intact despite their circumstances. "You are very kind," the woman said, as Samuel set the food before them. "I am called Ayana. This is my father, Crowfeather, and my children, Running Wolf, Swiftbird, and Little Singing Water." Samuel nodded to each of them in turn. "I'm Samuel Crawford. This is my home, and you're welcome here until the storm passes." They ate slowly, carefully, with the deliberate motions of people who had been hungry for a long time. Samuel watched the little girl, Singing Water, as she held a piece of bread in both hands and nibbled at it like a small animal. Her mother, Ayana, tried to give her own portions to the children, but the old man spoke sharply to her in Blackfoot, and she resumed eating with obvious reluctance. "He says I must eat too," she explained to Samuel. "He says I cannot care for them if I do not care for myself." "He's right," Samuel said quietly. "There's enough for everyone." As the evening wore on, the family began to relax slightly, the warmth and food working their magic. The children's color improved, and even the old man seemed to sit a little easier in his chair. Samuel found himself studying them, noting the careful way they moved, the respect they showed to each other, the quiet dignity that poverty and hardship had not been able to touch. "Where were you heading?" Samuel asked when they had finished eating. Ayana looked at her father, who nodded slightly. "The reservation," she said. "Fort Belknap. We were told there would be food there, help for the winter." Samuel knew about Fort Belknap, knew the conditions there were harsh, and the government supplies often inadequate. He also knew that the journey from wherever they had started was long and dangerous, especially in winter. "How far have you come?" 7 days walking," she said. "We had horses, but they died. We had food, but it ran out. We had warm clothes, but—" She gestured to their thin garments, and Samuel understood. They had traded everything they could to survive the journey, and it still had not been enough. "The little one," Samuel said, nodding towards Singing Water, who had fallen asleep in her mother's arms. "She's been sick." Ayana's face tightened. "Fever. 3 days now. She is better, but still weak." Samuel felt something twist in his chest, a memory of his own son burning with fever, of helpless nights watching and waiting. "I have medicine," he said. "Not much, but something that might help." He brought what he had, simple remedies that Margaret had left behind, and watched as Ayana administered them to the sleeping child with practiced hands. She was clearly a mother who had tended sick children before, who understood the balance between hope and fear that came with fever in the young. "You have children?" she asked, noting his knowledge of the medicines. "Had," Samuel said quietly. "A son and a daughter. The boy died of fever 2 years ago. The girl is grown now, married and moved away." Ayana nodded, understanding passing between them that needed no words. They were both parents who had lost children, who had sat beside small beds and wondered if mourning would bring relief or sorrow. The bond formed in that moment was wordless but profound, built on shared grief and the particular love that comes from caring for the helpless. The storm continued through the night, the wind howling around the house like a living thing. Samuel gave the family his bedroom and made himself comfortable on the sofa, but he slept fitfully, waking often to check the fire and listen to the sounds of the house. Once, near dawn, he heard singing, a low, melodic sound that seemed to come from the very walls. He rose and peered into the bedroom to see Ayana sitting beside her daughter, singing softly in Blackfoot while the child slept. The old man sat nearby, his eyes closed, but his lips moving in what might have been prayer. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. The drifts reached nearly to the windows, and the familiar landscape of Samuel's ranch had become alien and beautiful. He made breakfast for his guests, watching as they prepared to continue their journey with a reluctance that surprised him. Over the course of one night, these strangers had become something else, not quite family, but more than temporary visitors. "The snow is deep," Samuel said as they gathered their few possessions. "It will be hard traveling." "We must go," Ayana said. "We have taken too much of your kindness already." But Samuel found himself reluctant to see them leave, these people who had filled his empty house with voices and purpose. "Stay another day," he said. "Let the child rest, let the sun melt some of the snow." Crowfeather spoke in Blackfoot, his voice firm but not unkind. Ayana translated, "He says we cannot impose on your generosity. He says we have our own path to walk." Samuel nodded, understanding pride even when he disagreed with it. He helped them prepare for the journey, giving them what extra food he could spare, warmer clothing that had belonged to his family, and a small bag of coins that might help them along the way. As they prepared to leave, little Singing Water ran to him and pressed something into his hand, a small stone polished smooth and painted with symbols he did not recognize. "She says it is for protection," Ayana explained. "She says the spirits told her you need protecting too." Samuel knelt to the child's level, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he said. "I'll keep it safe." They left in the bright morning sun, dark figures against the white landscape, and Samuel watched from his window until they disappeared over the first ridge. The house felt emptier than before, the silence more complete, and he found himself listening for voices that were no longer there. He went about his chores mechanically, his mind replaying moments from the previous day, the way Running Wolf had helped with the firewood, the soft sound of swift birds' laughter, the warmth in Ayana's eyes when she spoke of her children. It was 3 days later when Samuel first saw the smoke on the horizon, thin columns rising from the valley beyond his ranch. At first, he thought it might be a wildfire, but the smoke was too regular, too controlled. As the day progressed, he began to make out movement in the distance, and by evening he could see that it was people, many people, moving slowly across the snow-covered prairie toward his ranch. Samuel stood on his porch with his rifle, watching the approaching group with growing amazement. There were perhaps 30 people, men and women and children, traveling with horses and travois loaded with supplies. They moved in the organized fashion of a tribe on the move, but their direction was unmistakable. They were coming to his ranch. As they drew closer, Samuel recognized the figure leading them. Crowfeather, the old man who had sat by his fire 3 nights ago, now mounted on a painted horse and wearing the regalia of a chief. Behind him rode others, men and women, whose bearing spoke of authority and respect within their community. And there, riding beside a young warrior, was Ayana, her children mounted on a gentle mare. The group stopped at the edge of Samuel's property, and Crowfeather rode forward alone. When he reached the porch, he dismounted and approached with the formal dignity Samuel remembered from their first meeting. He spoke in Blackfoot, his voice carrying clearly across the still air, and then Ayana translated from her position with the group. "He says you saved his family," she called out. "He says you shared your food and your fire when you had no reason to trust us. He says this is the mark of a true man, and that true men should not live alone." Samuel felt his heart begin to race, though he wasn't sure why. "What does he mean?" Crowfeather spoke again, gesturing toward the assembled group. He says these are our people, the survivors of our band. He says we have voted, and we choose to spend the winter here with you if you will have us. Samuel stared at the group, trying to process what he was hearing. Here, on my ranch, he says your land is good, your water is sweet, and your heart is generous. He says we will work for our keep, that we will share the labor and the food. He says we will be neighbors, not guests. The implications were staggering. Samuel looked out at the assembled tribe, seeing faces both young and old, seeing the hope and uncertainty in their eyes. They were offering him something he had not even realized he wanted: community, purpose, the chance to be part of something larger than his own grief. "What about the law?" Samuel asked. "What about the reservation?" Ayanna rode closer, her face serious. "The reservation is far, and the winter is hard. Many will die if we go there now. But here, with you, we can survive. We can work together, share our skills, protect each other." Samuel thought about the empty bedrooms in his house, the silence that had become his constant companion, the way his heart had lifted when he heard children's voices in his home. He thought about the way Ayanna's eyes had softened when she spoke of her children, the dignity with which Crowfeather had accepted his help, the trust that little Singing Water had shown him. "What would you need?" he asked. Crowfeather smiled, the first time Samuel had seen him do so. He spoke at length, and Ayanna translated. "He says we need only what we can make with our hands and what the land provides. We have supplies, tools, knowledge. We can build shelters, hunt game, preserve food. We ask only for the right to share your land and your protection." Samuel looked out at the group again, seeing them differently now. Not as strangers or potential threats, but as people who had chosen to trust him, who had seen something in him worth believing in. He thought about Margaret, about what she would have said about this moment, and he could almost hear her voice. "Samuel Crawford, you were never meant to live alone." "Yes," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the still air. "Yes, you can stay." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Voices rose in what could only be celebration, and Samuel saw tears on faces both young and old. Crowfeather raised his hand for silence, then spoke again, his voice formal and profound. "He says you are no longer Samuel Crawford who lives alone," Ayanna translated, her own voice thick with emotion. "He says you are Samuel Crawford who feeds the hungry, who shelters the lost, who builds bridges between peoples. He says you are family now, and family takes care of family." What followed was a transformation that Samuel could never have imagined. Within days, his ranch had become a small village with traditional lodges arranged in a respectful circle around his house. The Blackfoot had brought their own supplies and tools, and they worked with an efficiency that amazed him. The men hunted and built shelters, the women processed food and made clothing, and the children played in the snow with a joy that filled the air with laughter. Samuel found himself learning things he had never expected to know. How to construct a lodge that could withstand prairie winds, how to preserve meat in the traditional way, how to read weather signs that his new neighbors had been observing for generations. In return, he shared his knowledge of farming, of working with cattle, of the white man's ways that might help them navigate the changing world. But it was the small moments that changed him most profoundly. Singing Water, fully recovered from her fever, became his constant companion, following him around the ranch and chattering in a mixture of Blackfoot and English that somehow made perfect sense. Running Wolf proved to have a gift for working with horses, and Samuel found himself teaching the boy skills his own son would never learn. Swiftbird helped the women with their work, but also spent hours with Samuel, learning to read from the few books in his house. And Ayanna became something Samuel had not expected to find again. Not a replacement for Margaret, but something new and equally precious. She moved through his house with a natural grace, cooking meals that filled the air with unfamiliar but wonderful scents, mending clothes with patterns that told stories, bringing life to spaces that had been empty for too long. "You are happy," she said one evening as they sat by the fire while the children played nearby. It was not a question, but an observation, and Samuel realized with surprise that it was true. "I am," he said. "I didn't expect to be, but I am." "My father says happiness is like water," she said. "It finds the lowest place and fills it up." Samuel considered this, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "I think I was pretty low," he admitted. "We all were," Ayana said quietly. "But now we are not alone." The winter passed in a blur of activity and discovery. Samuel learned to appreciate the complex social structure of the tribe, the way decisions were made collectively, the deep respect shown to elders, and the careful attention paid to children. He participated in ceremonies he did not fully understand, but felt honored to witness, and he began to see his own Christian faith not as something in conflict with their beliefs, but as part of a larger understanding of the sacred. When spring came, Samuel expected the tribe to move on, to continue their journey to the reservation or to seek their own land. But Crowfeather had other ideas. He had been watching the way the partnership worked, the way both sides had benefited from the arrangement, and he proposed something unprecedented, a permanent settlement. "He says your ranch is large enough for all of us," Ayana translated during one of their evening conversations. "He says we can build a real village here, with houses for those who want them, and traditional lodges for those who prefer them. He says we can farm and ranch together, share the profits, create something new." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. "What about the law? What about the authorities?" "He says the law is changing," Ayana said. "He says there are other places where whites and natives live together, work together. He says we could be pioneers in our own way." It was a radical idea, the kind of experiment that could succeed brilliantly or fail catastrophically. But as Samuel looked around at the thriving community that had grown up around his ranch, at the children who played together regardless of their heritage, at the adults who had learned to respect and depend on each other, he realized that the experiment had already begun. "What do you think?" he asked Ayana. She was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I think," she said finally, "that my children are happy here. I think they are learning things they could not learn on the reservation, becoming people they could not become anywhere else. I think this is what the future looks like, if we are brave enough to build it." Samuel nodded slowly. "Then let's build it." The legal arrangements were complex, requiring negotiations with territorial authorities and federal agents who were unsure how to classify their unique community. But Samuel's reputation as a respected rancher, combined with the obvious success of the arrangement, eventually won them grudging acceptance. They were granted permission to establish what became known as the Crawford Settlement, a mixed community that would serve as a model for others. Years passed, and the settlement grew. More families joined them, both white and native, drawn by reports of a place where different peoples could live together in harmony. They established schools where children learned both English and Blackfoot, where traditional stories were told alongside Shakespeare, where the skills of two cultures were woven together into something new and strong. Samuel married Ayana in a ceremony that blended Christian and Blackfoot traditions, surrounded by a community that had become their extended family. They raised their children together, his daughter Emma visiting from Denver with her own family, Swiftbird and Running Wolf growing into strong young adults who moved easily between worlds. On quiet evenings, Samuel would sit on his porch and watch the sun set over the settlement, seeing the smoke rising from chimneys and lodge fires, hearing the sound of children playing and adults calling to each other in multiple languages. He would think about that night when he had opened his door to a desperate family, never imagining that one small act of kindness would change everything. Crowfeather, now truly an elder, would sometimes join him on the porch, the two old men sitting in comfortable silence as they watched their community thrive. They had become more than friends, more than neighbors. They had become family in the truest sense, bound not by blood, but by choice, by shared struggle, by the decision to build something better than what they had found. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked one evening as they watched Singing Water, now a young woman, teaching a group of children to sing in Blackfoot. Crowfeather considered the question seriously, as he considered all questions. When he spoke, Ayana, now Samuel's wife of 15 years, translated without being asked. "He says, regret is for people who had other choices," she said. "He says we did what we had to do to survive, and we did it together. He says that is the only way anything good ever gets built." Samuel nodded, understanding more than the words conveyed. They had taken a risk, all of them, when they decided to trust each other across the divide of race and culture. They had faced opposition, suspicion, and outright hostility from some quarters. But they had also created something unprecedented, a community where children grew up thinking it was normal for people of different backgrounds to live together, work together, love each other. As the stars came out over the Montana prairie, Samuel felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with belonging. He was no longer a man alone with his grief, but part of something larger, something that would continue long after he was gone. The settlement would face challenges in the years to come, as all communities do. There would be conflicts to resolve, prejudices to overcome, and the constant work of building understanding between different ways of life. But the foundation was solid, built on the simple recognition that kindness creates more kindness, that trust can be earned across any divide, and that family is not about blood, but about choice. In the end, Samuel Crawford had not just fed a group of starving people. He had opened his door to the future, and the future had come flooding in with all its complexity and promise. The lonely rancher had become the center of a new kind of family, one that would grow and change and adapt, but that would always remember the winter night when a desperate knock on the door changed everything. The prairie wind carried the sound of laughter across the settlement, and Samuel smiled, knowing that Margaret would have approved. After all, she had always said their house was too big for just one family. It had just taken him a while to figure out how to fill it.